In the year 59 AD, the Roman Senate rose to its feet and they were applauding the emperor, not for a victory in a battle, not for restoring peace. They were congratulating Nero for murdering his own mother. And the entire Senate stood. Everyone was praising the emperor, but one man did something totally different. He stood up and walked out. No speech, no accusation, just silence. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood exactly the meaning of his act. Because in the ancient world, this act had a name, and it was called Parrhesia. It is a word that the Greeks and the Romans used for something far more dangerous than what we call today freedom of speech. Parrhesia meant to speak the truth openly, even when doing so could destroy your career, your reputation, or even your life. And this was not just a right, it was virtue, it was a way of living. Today we often think that free speech is something, it is some kind of a legal protection, but in the ancient world, parrhesia was something much deeper. It was a moral test of freedom of spirit. A citizen was considered truly free if he had the courage to speak openly, even against the powerful, even against the majority, even against a tyrant. And throughout history, some paid the ultimate price for it. Parrhesia was the dangerous act of telling the truth. And the question it raises is as urgent today as it was 2000 years ago. What does it truly mean to speak freely? Parrhesia and the free citizen of Athens. The word parrhesia comes from two Greek words, pan, which means all, everything, and rhesis, meaning speech. Literally, it means to say everything. But in the Greek world, the meaning was far deeper than simple openness of speech like today, free speech, to say whatever you want. Parrhesia meant speaking openly, truthfully, and without concealment, even when doing so carried a risk. It was not a rhetorical technique, it was a moral quality of character, of your very existence. The Greeks and the Romans, they believed that only a truly free person could speak with parrhesia. And we see this idea clearly in the 5th century. In the tragedy Hippolytus, Euripides uses the phrase "elεύθεροι παρρησία θάλοντες," free men that are flourishing in parrhesia. The phrase reveals something fundamental about political thought. Freedom did not just mean living without chains, freedom meant having the courage to speak openly in the public sphere. In the democracy of Athens, parrhesia was not simply tolerated, it was expected. The citizen in the assembly had both the right and the responsibility to speak honestly about public affairs. Silence in the face of injustice was considered a failure of civic duty. This freedom, of course, was never simple. Parrhesia was a dangerous thing because it placed the speaker in conflict with power, with the majority, or sometimes even with friends. To practice parrhesia meant risking reputation, status, and sometimes even exile, which is why they did not consider it a casual freedom. They considered it an arete, a virtue. Before the Greek city-states began to lose their independence and declined, parrhesia was considered one of the defining qualities of the free citizen. It did not simply mean the right to speak. It meant the constant exercise of criticism and discernment in the very affairs of the city. The citizen was expected to question, to challenge, to examine the actions of their fellow citizens and of those in power, and public life required participation through speech and judgment. So for the Greeks, freedom was never something passive, it was an active responsibility. There is a very interesting linguistic coincidence in Greek that reflects this idea. The word politis, which is citizen, and oplitis, the heavily armed soldier of the Greek phalanx, are formed from the same letters. The hoplite defended the city on the battlefield. The citizen defended the city in the arena of public speech and discernment. So, in that sense, the ancient Greeks understood that the citizen is kind of a warrior of the mind, someone who protects the city not only with weapons, but with judgment, with courage, and parrhesia. And when the courage began to disappear, when fear, flattery, indifference started replacing open speech, the political freedom of the city began to weaken as well. Because without parrhesia, the citizen slowly stops being a citizen, and the city itself slowly stops being free. Parrhesia and philosophy. For philosophers, parrhesia had even a deeper meaning. It was not just a political act. It was a commitment to truth itself. For the philosophers, truth was not simply a statement that happens to be correct. It was a condition of the soul. Even the Greek word for truth reveals something of this idea. The word aleithia is traditionally seen as alithi, the removal of lithi, of forgetfulness, of concealment, conscious deliberation. Truth, therefore, is what emerges from hiddenness. It is the unveiling of what is real. It is the movement from unconscious living towards conscious awareness. So in this sense, the philosophical life was understood as a continuous movement away from forgetfulness and toward clarity and truth. For the philosopher, the last thing that truly mattered was his reputation or his standing within society. What mattered above all was his relationship with the cosmos. The entire orientation of the philosopher concerned his stance toward the gods, justice, and the order of the universe. Only after this came his relationship with other human beings. His attitude towards others was simply the reflection of that deeper alignment. In other words, the philosopher did not speak truth in order to influence society. He spoke truth because he believed he was accountable to something higher than society, to the divine order, to justice, and to the structure of reality itself. And when someone lives this way, speaking openly becomes inevitable, because once a person aligns himself with truth, silence becomes impossible. There is another great word that is reflecting this, which is honesty. Honesty is Eilikrineia. Now, the meaning of the word Eilikrineia is judging something in the pure light of the sun, examining something without shadow or distortion.
So we have Eilikrineia, Eili, which means sunlight, the warmth of the sun, plus krino, which is to judge, to discern, where we get the word crisis from, and Ilios is the sun.
To live with parrhesia, therefore, was to live in alignment with this light of truth. So the philosopher was expected to examine himself, examine society, and examine power with complete honesty. And in that sense, Parrhesia in philosophical thought becomes something much more courageous than speech. It becomes the complete identification of the human being with truth itself. The person who lives in truth reverses the state of forgetfulness, of lethe, and it becomes a being who moves consciously with reality. The Greeks had another word, which is Deilia, which reverses the meaning, and it is the state of forgetfulness. Now, Deilia is cowardice.
Δίλη, δειλινόν, δειλός. From the Greek δειλ, which is associated with the fading of light. Δειλη is the late afternoon when the sun begins to weaken. Δειλινόν is the dusk, the moment when daylight fades. And δειλός is the coward. So the connection is symbolic. As light fades, courage fades with it. The coward is the one whose inner light weakens before the challenge arrives.
When the light diminishes, shadows grow longer. And when the light disappears, clarity disappears with it. In the darkness, truth becomes much harder to see, which is why for the Greeks the opposite of Parrhesia was not just silence, it was living in the twilight of the mind. The most famous example of this attitude of Eilikrineia and Parrhesia is Socrates. Socrates spent his life asking uncomfortable questions in the streets of Athens. He challenged politicians, he challenged poets, he challenged the self-confidence of those who believed themselves to be wise, and he did not flatter anyone, he did not seek popularity, and ultimately, this commitment to truth led to his trial. So, in 399 BCE, Socrates stood before the Athenian jury and refused to abandon his way of life. He refused to stop questioning, he refused to remain silent, and in the end, he chose death over the abandonment of philosophy and truth. So the hemlock he drank became one of the most enduring symbols of Parrhesia. Because Socrates showed that speaking truth, it is not just something, it is not just an intellectual act. It is a moral stance and an attitude toward life itself. It is Eilikrineia. Parrhesia as ethical practice. In later philosophical schools, Parrhesia was a method of ethical training. Philodemus, a Stoic philosopher, describes Parrhesia as a form of frank criticism between friends. So, within philosophical communities, students and teachers practiced open speech in order to correct one another's faults. It was like a practical exercise. And this practice required a very specific character. According to Philodemus, the true practitioner of Parrhesia must possess good intention, freedom from envy, generosity, indifference to reputation, and without these qualities, frank speech easily becomes something else. It becomes insult, bitterness, or even malice. So true Parrhesia resembles the work of a physician, of a doctor. It is a prescription drug. Sometimes it is painful, but ultimately it is intended to heal.
There is another insight, much later in history, that sheds light on why Parrhesia is so rare. The 20th century philosopher George Gurdjieff made a very disturbing observation about human psychology. According to Gurdjieff, most people believe they possess free will and independent thought, but in reality, they are largely mechanical. They react automatically to fear, to ambition, to social approval, and emotional impulses. What they call their opinion is often nothing more than a temporary voice inside them. One moment it is fear speaking, another moment it is ambition, another moment the desire to belong. Gurdjieff says, man is a plurality, man's name is legion. In other words, the human being is not a unified self, but a collection of competing impulses. And this creates a profound problem for truth, because if a person does not truly know himself, he cannot speak from a stable center. He may speak loudly, he may speak passionately, but he does not speak freely. So, in this sense, the ancient demand for self-knowledge, γνώθη σαυτόν, becomes essential for Parrhesia. Without inner awareness, speech remains mechanical. Only the person who has begun to observe himself can gradually become capable of speaking truth rather than merely repeating reactions. This is why the philosophical schools of antiquity insisted so strongly on the training of consciousness, because Parrhesia is not simply the courage to speak, it is the capacity to speak from a conscious self. The teaching of George Gurdjieff may appear to belong to a completely different spiritual tradition, spiritual narrative. Yet when one looks more carefully, something interesting becomes visible. Many of the practices he described resemble the methods that once existed within the philosophical schools of the ancient world. In antiquity, philosophy was not like it is today, primarily theoretical. It was practical training, a discipline of attention, of self-observation, and inner transformation. Students were expected not only to study ideas, but to work on themselves, to observe their reactions, examine their assumptions, and gradually free themselves from mechanical habits of thought and emotion. Over the centuries, however, much of this practical dimension of philosophy disappeared. As the religious culture of late antiquity took hold, many philosophical traditions were gradually suppressed or marginalized, and in several periods they were even condemned as paganism or idolatry. But the word Parrhesia survived, yet its meaning was gradually transformed. In the next part of the video, we will explore how a word that once meant fearless truth-telling slowly came to signify something entirely different. Philosophy slowly transformed from a lived discipline into an intellectual activity confined largely to texts and academic study. Seen in this light, the work of Gurdjieff can be understood in a completely different way. Rather than inventing something entirely new, he may have reintroduced certain elements of an older tradition. Without self-knowledge, without understanding the working and functions of his machine, man cannot be free. He cannot govern himself, and he will always remain a slave. George Gurdjieff. The practical work on consciousness that once formed the heart of the philosophical schools. Practices of attention, of self-observation, and inner discipline. This kind of training that could produce individuals capable not only of thinking clearly, but also of speaking truthfully. In other words, individuals capable of Parrhesia.
Parrhesia under tyranny. The greatest test of Parrhesia, of course, appears when freedom starts disappearing under tyranny, when speech becomes a very dangerous thing. And in such moments, Parrhesia transforms from a civic virtue to, to an act of resistance, right? So, this is exactly what happened in Rome during the reign of Nero. By the first century AD, the Roman Senate had lost its power, it had lost its uh, independence. Fear and flattery had totally replaced open debate, and many senators were choosing silence in order to protect their seats and their careers. But one man refused to participate in this culture of submission. This man was the Stoic senator and Stoic philosopher Thraseas Paetus, and he became famous for his uncompromising honesty. When Nero demanded public praise for basically the murder of his mother, Thraseas refused to take part in this whole ceremony, and instead he stood up and quietly walked out of the Senate. And the gesture was simple, but everyone understood its meaning. It was Parrhesia expressed through action rather than speech. The consequences soon followed. In 66 AD, Nero ordered the Senate to condemn Thraseas to death. When the sentence reached him, Thraseas did not panic. He gathered his friends and he began a conversation discussing philosophy, particularly the immortality of the soul. Then, in a calm manner, which was typical for the Stoic tradition, it opened his veins, and as the blood flowed, he made an offering and addressed Zeus, Jupiter, as Zeus the liberator. And this was his final act of freedom. So for the Stoics, death itself could become the ultimate form of Parrhesia, a life lived in truth, even to its final moment. But if Parrhesia was once considered one of the highest virtues of the ancient world, how did it slowly disappear from political life? It didn't happen from one day to the other, it happened gradually. And why does modern society struggle so much with honest speech? To understand this transformation, we must look at one of the most profound shifts in Western intellectual history, the transition from the classical world to the religious culture of late antiquity. But there is another important element that must be understood, that the philosophical education of the ancient world was completely different from what we call education today. The purpose of the philosophical schools was not just the accumulation of information, it was the formation of the human being. So the schools of philosophy aimed to cultivate self-awareness, self-knowledge, discernment, alongside intellectual ability. Students were trained to examine their own thoughts, to question their assumptions, and to recognize the contradictions within themselves. They were expected to observe their emotions, understand their desires, and distinguish between what they just wanted than what was truly necessary. In other words, philosophy was not simply a discipline, it was a training of consciousness. And this is what made individuals capable of Parrhesia. Because the problem is that a person who does not understand himself is easily manipulated. Someone who cannot observe his own impulses can be driven by fear, by ambition, by desire, by flattery, or by group pressure. Such a person may speak loudly, but he cannot speak freely. The philosophical traditions of antiquity understood this very, very clearly. freedom of speech requires freedom of mind, and freedom of mind requires self-knowledge. In contrast, modern education focuses primarily on what? On the transmission of technical knowledge and professional specialization. Students may learn vast amounts of information, but very rarely receive training in observing their own thinking, recognizing their biases, or examining contradictions with their beliefs, or to learn how to control their emotions. So, without self knowledge, opinions can very easily be shaped by ideology, propaganda, or social pressure. This is why the disappearance of proper philosophy or proper philosophical training had consequences far beyond the philosophical school, or it had consequences in society. It alters the very structure of society, because a society that does not cultivate self-awareness, self-aware individuals, inevitably becomes much easier to control. And when such individuals disappear, Parrhesia disappears with them. The modern problem. Today, the phrase free speech appears constantly everywhere, in political discussions, everywhere, media. But the ancient concept of parrhesia reminds us that freedom of speech was never just a legal matter. For the Greeks and the Romans, in the good times of the empire, it was primarily an ethical responsibility. The parrhesiastis, the one who practices parrhesia, does not speak simply because he has the right to speak. He speaks because he believes truth must be spoken, even when doing so carries personal cost. And this distinction is crucial, right? Because speech without courage is nothing more than opinion. Parrhesia begins when truth becomes more important than safety. And this is precisely where the modern world reveals a deep contradiction. Today, almost anyone can speak publicly. We have television studios, newspapers, digital platforms, but all this abundance of speech, it doesn't necessarily produce truth. Journalists may repeat narratives shaped by economic and political interests. Politicians often speak constantly, yet rarely with any weight that the very word politics once carried.
Politics, from the Greek polis, which means city, and politia, which is the order of the community. The root is connected with polos, the pole, the axis, the point that stands between opposing poles and keeps balance. In this original sense, the politikos was not simply a ruler or party leader, he was the one who understood where he stood between opposing forces so that justice and the common good could be preserved. For this reason, in the Greek tradition, the true politician was expected to be a philosopher. Otherwise, one may choose another word, but not the word politician.
Citizens frequently believe themselves to be politically engaged while remaining largely shaped by slogans, ideologies, and group identities. Ideologues defend their positions with passion, yet they struggle to see the contradictions with their own doctrines. Even in the technological field, technology and innovation, decisions that shape the future of entire societies are sometimes made without any serious reflection on their ethical consequences. In such an environment, speech becomes abundant, but parrhesia becomes rare because parrhesia requires something far more demanding than the simple ability to speak. It requires self-knowledge, independence of judgment, and the courage to stand against the collective pressure. And these qualities cannot be produced by institutions alone. They must be cultivated within the individual. And this is why, in the ancient world, parrhesia was never understood as a privilege granted by the state. It was understood as the expression of a free and disciplined soul. The courage to speak. From the assemblies of Athens to the philosophical dialogues of Socrates to the silent defiance of Thraseas Paetus in the Senate of Nero, parrhesia remained one of the most demanding virtues of the ancient world. It asked a simple but terrifying question. Not whether you can speak, but whether you dare to speak the truth when it is dangerous. Socrates chose the hemlock. Thraseas chose death rather than flattering Nero. And their lives remind us that parrhesia was never about speaking loudly. It was about speaking when silence would have been much safer. And maybe that's why they considered it one of the highest signs of freedom. Because the truly free person is not the one who can say anything they like. It's the person who has the courage to say what must be said. And perhaps this is why in the year 59 AD, when the Roman Senate rose to applaud an emperor for murdering his own mother, one man stood up and walked out, and that act had a name, parrhesia.